Okay, so welcome to Intelligently Designed Gospels. And this is an incredibly good phrase to have, and that they were intelligently designed. This could be one of the most important ideas that you actually come across. And I'm going to try and highlight that here. It will lead us to a perfection in seeing a perfection in the Word. So often in Christianity, when we're hearing about the Gospels, they come up with this idea that it's for writers or for witnesses to a car crash. And one of the people there was in the car when it was going. Another person was on the sidewalk and watching the same crash, and another person was up in an apartment building and looking down on this. And that is how a lot of Christianity explains the Gospels. And that is, in my opinion, 100% false. This has no feeling, there is no feeling in the writer, the author. There is no distraction that could occur. Everything that is written is 100% accurate and designed to be there. There is no mistake. We have to take 2 Peter 1, 20 and 21. But know this, first of all, that no prophecy of Scripture is a matter of one's own interpretation. For no prophecy was ever made by an act of human will, but men moved by the Holy Spirit spoke from God. So there is no interpretation with the gospel. It is 100% perfect. So Jesus is the most dynamic person to have ever lived, and he has 4 gospel accounts giving a different, intelligently designed view, a different perspective on who this amazing man, God, Jesus Christ, is. So fasten your seatbelts. We are going to be diving into this. This was when I was in college. We held this event called Christianity on Trial. And one of them was an unbelieving professor was bringing up his critiques on why the Bible was in error. And some of the points that he brought up with was the resurrection that occurs at Christ's death, where there is a resurrection of all the saints and they go into the holy city and proclaim to many. This, he thought, was such an enormous event that it should be in every single gospel, and it was only found in Matthew. Another point he brought up is the boy Jesus as a youth, occurs only in the Gospel of Luke. And he thought that was a big enough event that should be in every gospel as well. And while he may be true in what he brought up as the detail, his conclusion in the matter was incredibly wrong. So what we are going to do in this talk is we are going to take an analysis of the forest of the Gospels. We are going to look from a distant point of view and look at this forest and see the forest, and then we are going to zoom in on this forest and focus on the specific trees, details within each tree, and get a close perspective of this. So with this idea, we are going to be highlighting a lot of differences within each gospel. And as we move into this, we see the purpose of each gospel. We need to have the purpose in mind. And like Nathan had spoken about earlier, we have Matthew showing the view. The purpose is that Jesus is the king, the perfect king. In Mark, we have the servant view. The servant is the purpose, proving that Jesus is the perfect servant, even the suffering servant. Luke, that it is Jesus is the perfect man, and John's perspective is that Jesus is God. Now, when we think about the author of each gospel, they are specifically kind of good to write that perspective. The fact that we come to Matthew or Levi, and he is a tax collector, and he is writing about the perfect king. Well, this tax collector actually worked in the ins and outs of the Roman government in collecting taxes from the Israelite people. So he is writing an account of government regarding Matthew. Or Mark, the aspect that Mark is also known as John Mark, and we pick up his story in the book of Acts, and he is the servant of Paul and Barnabas. And not only that, but there is even the debate whether John Mark is transcribing his account from Peter, because he has a close connection to Peter after the book of Acts, and we see that. So was John Mark Peter's servant in writing this gospel? Maybe, maybe not. Luke is writing the perfect man account, and we know that he is a doctor, and he also has an element of a historian within him, and he is writing all the details pertaining to the doctor giving his diagnosis of the man. When John comes and is giving the account of God, you can actually have no credentials to write this. You cannot say that John is, oh, I'm a godly figure, so I'm going to write the godly account. There is no credentials for John writing this. And we see in John 1:6 that there was a man who was sent from God to testify about Jesus, to testify about the light. So what is John's credentials? Well, he was a man who was commissioned from God. And not only that, since his task is so enormous, outside of this first reference to himself, which first is kind of in a little bit of a third-person view, he also talks, all the other references within this gospel is referenced in the third person, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And that is because this task of proving that Jesus is God is so monumental that he puts himself in the third person, separating himself from it. So now as we want to lay the foundation of this, that should really be in our head, the king, servant, man, God, gospel, the four gospel accounts, we want to, let's say, prove the theory. So Matthew's gospel, the first thing that it starts off with is the lineage. The first thing is the lineage. Why? Because before we can even start a discussion on the king, it is, what is the king's lineage? If you don't have the lineage of the king, this conversation will not continue. So it is the kingly lineage. And how does this start? It starts with the nation that Jesus was said to be a king of. He was the king of the Jews. So we start with Abraham, and then we're moving forward. And as we move forward, we go through David, Solomon, Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, and so on. And then we produce Jesus. However, when we come to a lineage, which is actually in Luke 3, which we will talk about later, it is not a forward lineage, and it does not start with Abraham. You start with the man with the man Jesus, and you work backwards. So you start with the man himself. How do you prove that he's the man? You go backwards. And it goes backwards. It goes backwards through David's lineage, not through Solomon, but with Mary through Nathan. And it goes back, and it goes back past Abraham. It goes past Noah, all the way back to Adam, the first man, and ultimately God. And there is no lineage in Mark, because who really cares the lineage of a servant? There is no lineage in John, because God has no lineage. So when we have birth stories, we have a birth story in Matthew, detailed in Matthew and Luke. The John birth story is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So that is the birth story of John. But what is the birth story of Matthew? We see Jesus' conception through the angel of Joseph. We see the star, the wise men, the gifts, right? The wise men appearing to Herod, Herod's inquiry with the scribes of where the Messiah is going to be born, right? We have that Herod is going to massacre the children to, hopefully kill the Messiah at Bethlehem. We see Joseph taking his family to save the Messiah king, leaving for Egypt. We have their return after Herod was dead. All of these are the birth story of the king. And not one of them is recorded in the birth story of Luke. When we turn to Luke, we see a completely different birth story. We see the shepherds that are keeping watch over their flocks by night. We see that Jesus was born in a manger. We see that after Jesus' birth, he was presented at the temple, right? We come across common people like Simeon and Anna in the temple. So all of this is the humble birth stories of the perfect man. And not one of these, shepherds, the angels to Mary, all this is in the Gospel of Matthew. So did this professor forget about this, that the birth stories, the lineages are all completely different before we come? No, he just was ignorant to the fact of the purposes. So if we take the temptations, right? You have a temptation in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But you have no temptations in John. Why is this? Because God cannot be tempted. So you have a temptation in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and it actually is just a one verse in Mark that Jesus was tempted. Why? It's important that we know the servant is tempted, but we don't really care about the details. So what about the transfigurations? We have a transfiguration in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but we have no transfiguration in John. Why do we have no transfiguration in John? Because Jesus always is and always will be. He is filled with glory regardless. So the God view has no transfiguration because he always is. However, the king, the servant, and the man can be transfigured. Jesus is much more than a king, much more than a servant, and much more than a man, and he can be transfigured. How about the baptisms? We actually have a baptism account in all four Gospels. We have the baptism in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But when we actually come to the John baptism, it is not the fact that Jesus was baptized that is important. It is John the baptizer's narrative that is given to him that you need to baptize this one. And when you do, you're going to see this, the dove coming down on the one, and it's all about John and what John realizes with this one he is baptizing. So you have Jesus being identified as a submissive one, as a king. The king is submissive. The servant is submissive. The man is submissive. And even Jesus is submissive to God. Okay, as we have a pretty good foundation there, we can turn to specifics with Jesus in Matthew's gospel, being the perfect king. Now, we notice specifics of the quotes in the Old Testament. There are 60, count them, 60 Old Testament quotes in Matthew. And 14 of them are saying that which was spoken by, or that which was spoken, and it's a call out to the Old Testament, right? Because Jesus as the king was prophesied long, long ago, and he was known to be coming. So all of Matthew is focused on what was spoken before, proving this king that is to come. Also, let's take the Sermon on the Mount. Did you guys notice? It is the largest account in Matthew's gospel. What is the largest segment of Matthew's gospel? The Sermon on the Mount. It covers 3 chapters, chapters 5, 6, and 7. That is over 10% of his gospel, is the Sermon of the Mount. Why does the Sermon on the Mount make such a big deal? Why is it over 10% of Matthew's gospel? Because it is the kingdom laws. The king is proclaiming the laws of the kingdom. How about the parables? The parables are different than any other gospel in itself, right? There's a ton of them just in chapter 13 alone, right? The parable of the tares. You have the hidden treasure, right? The parable comparing the kingdom to a pearl. Or the dragnet, where they take the net and cast out the net and bring in all these fish, good and bad, and they toss out the bad. All these are elements within the kingdom that is being spoken about in Matthew and Matthew alone. The kingdom parables. What about another thing specific only to Matthew? The parable of the 10 virgins in Matthew 25, covering a chapter. Why is that so important to Matthew and only there? It is awaiting the return of the king. Do you have enough oil when the king is going to return? Because you need to. Or even the parable of the marriage of the king's sons in chapter 22. Very important because the king's son is getting married, and what is our attire supposed to be? Who's invited, certain things like that. Chapter 22 brings that up. Even Matthew's miracles focuses on these aspects, right? So how about this miracle that is only in Matthew? In chapter 17, the miracle of the coin in the fish's mouth. You remember this story? Why did this story even come about? This story came about because they come to Peter and they're like, do you and Jesus pay the temple tax? So it's talking about a tax, right? Peter says, yes. And then he goes to Jesus and says, do we pay the temple tax? What is this whole story even relating? Jesus is, so the son of the king, is he supposed to pay taxes or is he exempt? And Peter says, he's exempt. And Jesus says, you're right, he's exempt. But so that we may not cause offense, go out, cast a line, catch this fish. Inside the fish's mouth is going to be a coin. Take that coin, go pay our taxes. Right? Why is this story there? As I state it, it's obvious, right? Because, you're in this talk, you realize, whoa, that story makes complete sense in Matthew because it's paying taxes. So there it is. What about a huge discourse in Matthew is the 8 woes on the Pharisees in chapter 23. It encapsulates an entire chapter that Jesus is going off on these Pharisees. An entire chapter, right? He goes off on the Pharisees in other places and other gospels, but not to this degree. Jesus is going off on his political opponents in detail. And that is exactly how this chapter is focused. What if we focus, let's say, even on the wife of Pilate and her dream? Do you remember this one? Pilate, have nothing to do with that man. Leave him alone, right? Where are you going to find that? The governor who is in charge of sentencing Jesus, right? What about the 30 pieces of silver that are given and returned from Judas Iscariot, right? We are so in our culture, and maybe it's just us being humans, we are enthralled with the president and his assassination, right? The assassination of JFK and how it happened and, what was the aftermath of the assassinator, right? So Matthew is focused on the plot against Jesus, seeing Judas's remorse, right? After he throws the 30 pieces of silver back to the Pharisees, and they're like, oh, we can't use this money. It's blood money. So let's go buy the potter's field, right? All this is only in Matthew. What about the earthquake and the resurrection of the saints, right? It's very important that it only appears in Matthew, right? You have the start of the kingdom and the resurrection of the saints. The start of the kingdom, the start of the government, right? Proving the king. What about the soldiers that are connected to this whole event? right? The Pharisees' fear of the resurrection, that the disciples would go and steal the body, right? That they sealed the tomb with a signet, right? That there was an earthquake, the watch at the tomb, that the guards became like dead men, and even the cover-up afterwards. All of this is Matthew and the government proving the perfect king, his death, and that. Would you know that the soldiers aren't mentioned elsewhere? Right? During one of our Bible studies, someone asked me a question, said, where does this fit in putting these Gospels together? And I said, I have no idea, because the guards are only referenced in Matthew. And how about when Matthew ends the commission, baptizing nations, right? That they're identifying nations to be submissive to the coming kingdom. And that is how Matthew's gospel ends. So if we didn't have Matthew, we would be completely lacking in all of these elements. But when we turn to Mark, we see that Jesus as the perfect servant, and ultimately the suffering servant of the Old Testament, the Messiah, the suffering Messiah. But we see that Mark starts off his account with Jesus' ministry. Nothing is important before that if you're talking about a servant. What is important for the servant? When he serves. So we start off with John and his ministry preparing the way for Jesus. Now we see that it is action-packed. It is the shortest of the Gospels, and it is action-packed. It is story after story after story. You can get worn out just watching this servant, right? And as Nathan had even highlighted, the word immediately occurs 26 times in this 16-chapter book, right? And what is that? It is the servant's haste. Get on it. I need this done. Get on it. Immediately, Jesus did this. Immediately, he did that. And we also have the aspect that we're talking about a servant, so there is only 4 references to Jesus as Lord here, and only 2 of them are by the narrator. And those 2 are only after the resurrection. Only after the resurrection is Jesus called Lord in Mark's gospel. And this is not because he is not Lord. It is because this is not Mark's focus. The servant does get exalted in the end. But before that exaltation, it does not happen. Right? You have 2 people calling him Lord. So Mark doesn't have a lot of stories, like I just told you in Matthew, just story after story after story that is specific only to Matthew. Mark isn't like that. Mark has a lot of stories that are overlapped. And this isn't because of any error. This is just the aspect of the servant. The servant is focused on the details of the matter. It's not what Jesus said, but it's how he said it. It isn't what he necessarily did, but it is how he did it. It's like, let's say we had to have this example of building a building, right? The king can give the order and say, let's build that building. Whereas when Mark comes along, Mark's like, okay, I have this building to build. I gotta get the wood, I gotta get the nails, I gotta get the carpenters, we gotta get the blueprints. Like, how are we going to actually build this building? That is what Mark is focused on. So you have the details, and you have details that Mark gives that are specific that others do not give. But there is a couple things that stand out. There is a parable in Mark that is unique to Mark, and it's the kingdom's growing grain in Mark 4. So why is this only in Mark, as we know about this parable quite a bit in this ministry? Why is this only in Mark? Because it's how the kingdom comes. It's not that the kingdom's actually just going to come and be here. Mark tells us how it's coming First the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear, then the harvest comes. This is why this is only in Mark, because it's showing exactly how that comes. When we talk about specific details, that we had that transfiguration that we talked about that is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, well, we only have one detail from that is, well, there is a detail in Mark about it. His garments became exceedingly white, as no launderer on earth can whiten them. So you notice, you can have a similar statement, but Mark gives a detail that there's no way I could do laundry to get it that white. That is only the servant thought right there. Mark is thinking, holy cow, were those white. And we can't get them that white. I've tried. I am the servant, and I know that's not happening. That's miraculous. Or even the healing of the blind man of Bethsaida, that Jesus healed the blind man, and he's like, oh, people look like they're walking around like trees. And then Jesus continues to heal. That detail is, that miracle specific is only in Mark, but it's an incredible detail on Jesus in his healing. Or how about that there was another triumphal entry after the Sabbath, so that Jesus actually had more than one triumphal entry, and one of them appeared after the Sabbath? Only in Mark. That Jesus went after the triumphal entry. It was already late when he got to Jerusalem, because it was the Sabbath, after the Sabbath, and he looks around at everything and then leaves. That detail, only in Mark. How about the young man that is wearing linen that is being arrested in the garden, trying to be arrested in the garden with Jesus? Now, people have erroneously thought, oh, this is Mark inserting himself into this gospel. That was actually him. That's just utter foolishness. Mark is giving a detail that happened in the garden, and it is Lazarus that they were actually trying to seize. Why was Lazarus' life in danger? Because people were seeing the resurrected Lazarus after 4 days, and they wanted to kill him too. So Mark tells us this detail. How about the 2 rooster crows of Peter's denials? Both of them are in Mark. How about Joseph of Arimathea? That he actually has to gather up courage to go and ask Pilate for Jesus' body. Only in Mark. Mark's noticing, dude, it's not just that Joseph had to go and ask, that had to be really, really hard. And Joseph actually had to gather up courage to go do that. But Mark's gospel ends with the Mark 16 commission. We focused a lot on this because of its connection with the book of Acts. And notice how different it is than the Matthew commission. It is baptizing every creature. So the baptism of every creature is every individual of the Israelites in the Acts period had to be reached with a God-proclaimed message. So this commission that had to baptize every single individual, notice that it's the servant, realizing every creature has to get identified. But also notice how he ends. And they went out, past tense, everywhere, and they finished the work. That Mark 16 was completed, done, and over. So not only did the servant Mark bring in that you had to do this huge monumental task of identifying every creature, but that the work actually was done and finished and over. The servant noticed, and the servant tells us. How huge is that? So when we get to the Gospel of Luke, we see Jesus as the perfect man by our doctor and historian Luke. And as we look at Matthew, and Matthew started with the lineage, Luke does not start with the lineage. Luke starts just like all of us starts. Before we were born, he starts with family. And just like every single one of us, before we were born into a family. So we see the angel to Zechariah at the temple. We see Gabriel to Mary with the virgin birth. We see Elizabeth and Mary going and uniting, right? Jesus' mother with his close kin. We see the birth of John, right? Jesus' supposed cousin. So Jesus is born into a family. We see the census, the registration at Bethlehem, the shepherds, the angel, the manger. We see the presentation at the temple. We see the circumcision. Notice during his circumcision that there was the pour offering of 2 young pigeons, right? That Jesus was actually born into a poor family. Only in Luke we would have verses that the child continued to grow and become strong, as it is in 180 and 240. We see that phrase. That phrase is specific only to Luke. Just as the boy Jesus, who at 12 years old, let's call it his bar mitzvah, appeared at the temple during the Passover. Luke, as Jesus, portraying Jesus as the perfect man, we see that every perfect man has a lot of women and a lot of support of women in their lives. And Luke has a lot of women in his gospel. And this is not because of any human thought. This is God's thought of in helping Luke include the women that are surrounded with Jesus, right? So we have Elizabeth, we have Mary, we have Anna. Even the miracle when Jesus raises the son up, it's the widow of Nain that is the focus, right? That she needed her son back. And that you have the ministering women of chapter 8, right? Jesus' ministry was funded. Guess who funded him? The women. How about the woman at the Pharisee's house that Jesus specifically calls out and makes an example of? Mary and Martha? Where's the story of Mary and Martha? Right? It's specific. Don't you see these gospels are divinely inspired? They are perfect. They are intelligently designed. Where are you going to find a phrase, remember Lot's wife? The phrase is specific to Luke. What about daughters of Jerusalem? When Jesus was carrying his cross, when the cross was going up, Jesus calling off, having an aside, daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for yourselves. Weep not for me, but weep for yourselves, right? And then he continues his discourse. Or at the resurrection account, the group of women from Galilee. But it's not just women. It's also elements that we face as humans. Jesus had to, in order to become that perfect man, he dealt with a lot of things in regard to money and having enemies. So money and enemies are also a focus on Luke's gospel. Only in Luke's gospel we could have in chapter 7 the parable of repaid debts. This was centered around that woman, right? Simon, who loves me more? The one who sinned more or the one who sinned less? And then Simon the Pharisee says, the one who sinned more, right? Because they've been forgiven more. So we see that. What about the rich fool appearing only in Luke, right? He had to go build bigger barns, right? To store his stuff. What a fool, because that day he died. Or how about, since we did this with Matthew, the largest section of the book of Luke? What is the largest section of Luke's gospel? All the context surrounding the rich man and Lazarus. That's right. Depending on where you start the context, if it's 13, 14, 15, and 16, or whether you're just saying 14, 15, and 16. Even if you're considering 14, 15, 16, that's 3 chapters, and that is over 10% of his gospel. Focuses on this. And it is not like a Matthew 23 going off and rebuking his enemies. This is Jesus in his war as a man with the Pharisees. And there is a whole lot focused on money. The lost sheep, the lost coin, you have the prodigal son, the unjust steward, and the rich man and Lazarus. Such a focus on money. And it is completely different than the discourse in Matthew 23. How about the miscellaneous comments, right? Mark has a bunch, so does Luke, but they are totally different. The miscellaneous comments of Luke show Jesus' human tendencies, his feelings, his compassions, and his stress. So in 4:28, when we see that Jesus was filled with rage, yes, as a man, I am filled with rage. And we see that Jesus was also very angry at points. Jesus said to Herod, or not to Herod, about Herod, go and tell that fox. Where is this miscellaneous comment going to appear? It's going to appear in Luke. Or how about that his opponents were humiliated, right? That's a good comment for the man in his wrestlings with his enemies. Jesus says, blessed is he who doesn't take offense at me. Right? Men can be kind of offensive at times, unfortunately. My wife tries to tone it down quite often for the better. But yes, so Jesus, don't take offense at his humanity. And Luke even shows this humanity in the garden, right? When he was sweating, and his sweat appeared as drops of blood. The doctor, Luke, is prescribing a condition that is known as hematidrosis, that Jesus was actually suffering of a heart tear in the garden, and it was a possibility of him dying right there. Satan was attacking him. So you have this. But it's not just money and friends, okay, that Luke's focused on. Money and enemies. He also has the focus on friends. And he was also called the friends of tax collectors and sinners. And we also have a focus on Samaritans. So as we look at this, the miraculous catch of fish, Luke 5, where Jesus and Peter have that encounter, where Peter falls at Jesus' feet and says, Lord, get away from me, I'm a sinful man. Right? That's not the element of a king. It's an element of, you see this relational. He's in a boat. Like Peter is like dropping down on his knees because Jesus is the perfect friend. That Jesus actually had 70 to send out. The story of the Good Samaritan, only in Luke. The 10 lepers that were healed, where the one who returned was a Samaritan. Focus there. What about Zacchaeus? Only in Luke. Zacchaeus, come down from that tree. I'm going to eat at your house today. You see the fellowship aspect. What gospel? Even if I just told you this detail, you should be able to think about the purpose that we have been discussing here and see the detail and be like, that belongs in this gospel. Jesus, at his trial, connects eyes with Peter, and they have that connection. It's only in Luke. It's only in Luke that he has that. What about the thief on the cross? Jesus is hanging up there on the cross and has the conversation with the thief, and the thief backs up Jesus, where he's talking to the other thief, have you no honor? Like, we deserve this punishment. This man's done nothing wrong. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. What does Jesus say? I tell you the truth today, you will be with me in paradise. Where are you going to have that? You see this element of friendship. It is only in Luke. Or the Emmaus Road that ends Luke's gospel. Jesus walking along with two nobodies and goes and eats bread with them at their house. It's a Luke story. So when we get to the Gospel of John, we show that Jesus is God. Nathan did a great job with the expression of God that created everything that was in the beginning, that was, the Word becoming flesh. Even the thesis statement that these things were written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. That John focuses on 8 signs. That it's not a miracle, but it is. But it's really not a miracle because it's a sign. It's supposed to point you to something. What's it supposed to point you to? That Jesus is God, right? So John focuses on a word called martyrio, which is the witness. And there are throughout John's gospel witnesses, witnesses, witnesses. And they just come up. Whether it's John the Baptizer in 1:34. I myself have seen and have testified that this is the Son of God. What's Andrew's testimony? We have found the Messiah. Philip, we found of him who Moses and the law wrote about in the prophets. What about Nathanael? You are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Nicodemus, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God. The Samaritan woman of chapter 4, the Samaritans also of chapter 4. Nathan brought up Peter in chapter 6. You have the words of eternal life. You are the Holy One of God. Right? Even Martha has her testimony there. Lord, I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who has come into the world. Thomas's testimony, the doubter, my Lord and my God. So what does John have? He has the witnesses. What also does John have? He has the I am statements, right? The I am statements, the ego eimi. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. Before Abraham was born, I am. I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. I am the true vine. So if you have an I am statement, why does it appear only in John? Maybe because it's proving that he is the I am of the Old Testament. He is the God of the burning bush. So in this as well, we have belief and unbelief. And it's not just unbelief, but it's also the objections. The objections that are brought up. Why do people not believe? So John has focused his wording faith and the Greek word pistis. So faith is massively important to John, and bringing up, well, why did some people not believe? Why did his brothers not believe, who did believe later, right? What were some objections? Well, the Messiah was to be born in Bethlehem and the son of David. Or Jesus was born in Galilee. Or he is a Samaritan with a demon. Or even the debate that still goes out today. He was a good man, but he was a deceiver. Is he a good man or is he a deceiver? Or, in fact, is he God? So John brings up these objections, and he brings them up in a way that he actually thinks you will be convinced to believe that Jesus is God, that he is the Son of God. So only in John do we have so many deity claims that Jesus is God. My Father and I are working until now, and I myself am working. Where should that statement appear? The Jews were seeking all the more to kill him because he was making himself equal with God. Unless you believe that I am, you will die in your sins. I and the Father are one. because you being a man make yourself out to be God. Where are all these stories going to find their head? In John. How about all the equality statements with the Father? That there's no distinguishment between his works, that the life they inherently possess, the Father has the life, the Son has the life, the Son's judgment is equal to the judgment of the Father, the honor of the Father is equal to the honor of the Son, the honor or the power of Jesus is equal to the power of the Father, their words are the same. How about when Isaiah the prophet in Isaiah 6 sees the King, Jehovah, sitting on the throne and the glory is filling the temple? An enormous scene in Isaiah 6. Well, wouldn't it be interesting that John, of all people, is the only one who spoke that Isaiah saw Jesus on the throne and it was his glory, when John focuses so much on glory and the glory of Jesus? Or how about the statement, the conversation between Philip and Jesus, when Philip says, Jesus, show us the Father, right? Jesus seems a little annoyed. Philip, how can you say, show us the Father? If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. Or how about even Jesus' prayer in John 17? Now, Father, glorify me together with yourself with the glory which I have had with you before the world was. Where are these statements? They are so different than any other statements, and it is not because Jesus isn't God. It's just the aspect of what the focus of the book is. So if you're looking for the king, we're going to see statements there about the king, the servant, the man, and God. Right? So we can almost talk to that professor who does not believe and say, hey, why is the boy Jesus only referenced in Luke? Well, where else would you put it? It fits Luke's gospel entirely. And how come this is your only point, professor? Because I have 100 more that prove why it's only in Luke. So we can see that these are not random accounts. And maybe you can kind of get my mindset why I really, really dislike that car crash mentality that Christianity has out there. That when you view this story, when the Gospels, they're viewing Jesus coming along, and it's all from a different perspective. That's awful. Because the person up in the apartment doesn't have the same view. When you take what they are bringing, it's bringing it to errors. So hopefully now with this talk and realizing this is divinely selected scenes that are portrayed by each gospel to fit exactly what Jesus was and who Jesus was. So we can see, hopefully, we can look back at the gospels in the forest and then we can zoom in and we can be like, dude, these trees, yeah. Jesus looks at Peter during his trial. That's Luke. Like, oh, this is a Jesus with a woman. This is a focus on a woman. That's going to be in Luke. Or this is a kingly parable. No, that's Matthew, right? Every believer needs this truth because it can show even how perfect these gospels are designed. So there are so many, and I've been doing this, literally with the gospels for over a decade now, looking at differences and things like that. So, and I still come up with extra details, like all the time. Like, this was said this way. This detail is different. So there is more to this study, a lot more, because there are no ends to how deep God can go. So we need to go out and not only proclaim this truth, not only to teach this to some ignorant people who need to know how perfect this word is, that we can trust the Bible, but we can also go ourselves and dive in and discover more. And that's